I recognize that I and the few of us that are sitting up here and speaking are actually speaking for the thousands of students over the decades that were touched by our beloved Professor Edward W. Tayler. In language, the phrase changed our lives is overused, but not with respect to Professor Tayler. Maybe telling a little bit about my own story with him, and I know that these are similar to so many others, many of you in the audience will have them, will illustrate that best. I went to public school and honestly hated to read. I was a mediocre writer at best. Somehow I was able to sneak into Columbia without superimposing my head on a water polo picture. I arrived at Columbia with my preordained decision to pursue the law and to take the traditional political science route to get there. And then, Ted Tayler. What fortune. I so lucked out to be randomly assigned to his humanities course as part of the core. I walked in not knowing a thing about the Iliad, the Odyssey, or the Oresteia, and other books, other than those took up a lot of my budget and a lot of space on my shelf. But then, magic. I don't know what those other teachers I had failed to do, but in just days, Professor Tayler changed all of it. Words, thoughts, author's angst, meaning, themes, language, structure, wonderment, and relevance jumped out of every work from the Greeks through the modern novels that we read at the end of the year. And patiently, but with keen insight and uncanny ability, he nudged me to think, analyze, and especially to express myself more clearly, more interestingly, and more persuasively. I have to confess, however, my deep despair when I got my first paperback with so many of his writings that you've heard about, and so many of his comments, and especially how badly I felt that afternoon in my dorm room, until I realized that the G-O-O-N in the margin did not mean goon, it meant go on. I was smitten. I devoured every work and kicked myself for what I had missed in the books for which, now that the statute of limitations has ended, I can confess that some of which in high school I had done with Cliff Notes. See you later, contemporary civilization and political science. Hello, English literature, where I ended up taking every course that Professor Tayler taught, and those of his cherished Elizabethan period with some of his former students like David Shapiro and his trusted colleagues like Wallace Gray and Carl Ludwig Selig and Michael Rosenthal. This kid, who might have read Ivanhoe in a comic book, was taking a full-year course on Milton and Shakespeare and the Romantic poets. Who would have thunk it? Anyone who knew Ted and his ability to turn lights on in students would have known it. And that was just the classroom part. I asked Ted to be my advisor, and of course he said yes. He must have been the advisor for dozens and dozens of people. And we would talk in his office in philosophy about any number of subjects other than literature. He edited the things that I wrote and said when I served here as a university senator and in my outside political activities. He told me what out-of-the-way, off-Broadway play to see. He recommended a quaint bookstore. And then there was that time that I was dumbstruck in love with a Barnard woman, who at the time was dating someone else from home. And I went to him for some reason, and he saw that I was feeling bad, and I was there in his office, and I was moping and feeling that the world had ended. He let me pout for a small amount of time and complain, and then, becoming Cyrano to my being Christian, he looked up and he gave me the lines that I would speak to win her over. It worked. The relationship didn't last, but my turning to Ted always did. I am not embarrassed to admit, and I'm sure others in this room will also, that soon after I was sitting in Butler Library across the way, studying the Bard, watching this maestro, waxing on in his Ivy League-ish professor-like sports jacket with those weird elbow patches, his black turtleneck, his fry boots with the buckles on the side, and smoking non-filter cigarettes. Yes, we actually could smoke cigarettes in classrooms in those days. And I confess that it wasn't long before I, too, was wearing that jacket, buying those boots, and smoking the same smokes. I stand here today with a dilemma that Ted helped me through when I was in my junior year between the columns of law and philosophy, and had to make a decision. I was able to get a scholarship if I had wanted it to study literature at Cambridge, which Ted no doubt had a hand in helping me achieve. I stayed the course of what I had decided to be before I came to Columbia, went to law school, and moved to Washington, where I continue to practice. Given the nature of practice, and especially these days, I sometimes wonder if it had not been better off going to London and remaining in the world of words and poets that Ted Tayler had showed me, especially these days. I stayed in touch with Ted and Christina over the many years, over so many things. And like he did, no doubt, with so many others, he welcomed that. And he always knew the things that I was doing. We had meals in New York, sometimes out, sometimes at their apartment. The most recent, not even a year ago, when he gave me a piece that he was writing in a literature review, and we discussed Hamlet. When in a law case that I was working on that happened to be covered by the media, I quoted Milton's, "They also serve who only stand and wait." Ted called me and said he had smiled. And when I made a presentation in another case that had been covered, when I next saw him, Ted asked whether he had been wrong, that part of what I said in my concluding statements I had written in iambic pentameter. He was right. But he said, "You threw in an extra syllable." Even though I did move on, Ted has been and always will be with me for all the days I have, not just in my approved ability to read and to write and to think. When I came to Washington, I became involved and I helped lead the Shakespeare Theater Company, which brings Shakespeare and other classical works to thousands of people. One of my greatest joys was to bring Ted and Christina to Washington to come to an opening dinner and to a play. And I watched him that night, and I talked afterwards, and I think I saw him beaming. And I am sure he was beaming at the work. I am sure he was beaming at the performance. But I also think he understood that my work there was part of his influence and his legacy. I've interviewed applicants for the college for many years, in no small part because that school made such a big difference in my life. And there's no better reason and no bigger reason for that than Ted Tayler. I speak of him in every interview I do, and in every answer when people ask who were my greatest influences. And I know I am not alone when I say that. And so, it is my very deep honor and a privilege I will treasure forever to be one of the many people to remember him, to celebrate him, to honor him, to love him, and to miss him. No one would say it better than the Bard himself, who Ted had that poetic last moment to know, to pass from this earth the day Shakespeare was born and died, when in Julius Caesar it was written, "When beggars die, there are no comets seen. When heavens themselves blaze forth, the death of princes. Go out tonight and look up. The sky will be on fire."
I remember a graduate seminar with Ted. It would have been the spring of 1991. It was a small group of students, all of us in our first year of the graduate program. The feel was quite intimate, and we all had grown close over the semester. Still, though, we felt that we were neophytes, and he was the sage. At the end of the last class, we were all lingering. None of us wanted it to end. One of my more courageous peers pointed out that Ted had had a long and illustrious career, and that we were just embarking on our own amid rather uncertain academic waters. She asked if he might give us some parting words of wisdom. Ted paused just briefly, and we could see, to our surprise, that he actually was going to give an answer. It was, "Have your dental work done." Ted saw that we were teetering on the verge of inordinate devotion, and he told us exactly what we needed to hear. That was Ted's wisdom, that was Ted's wit, and it always was real. Ted had a gift for exposing conventional pieties that people didn't even know they had. In a Shakespeare lecture, I remember him telling the packed auditorium in Hamilton Hall that a terrible moment would come. That moment when you realize that never again will anyone love you just for your body. It was at that awkward moment that they understood that a marriage of true minds, as noble as it sounds, might not be the whole truth about love. Ted was a showman. He captivated seminars and lecture halls, but at the same time, he was always self-deprecating. From time to time, when he wanted to illustrate something with hand gestures, which he called audiovisual aids, he would ask everyone to turn their attention to the diminutive pedagogue at the front of the room. He was a great showman, but he never really was the show. We'd look to the front of the class, but the fireworks were in our heads. Ted would cross our mental wires, and we would reconnect them in ways that actually worked. Ted spoke of the nobility of teaching people to read, and he spoke of his job as making himself dispensable. In an era of ideology and isms, what he gave his students were the skills and the freedom to think for themselves. On several occasions, in speaking with me, he referred to himself as my former mentor. Of course, there was never anything former about it. I carried his image with me, and I modeled my pedagogical self on Ted early in my career. Over the years, I became less like him, not because I didn't think about him, but because his model was a model of genuine independence. As you've already heard, Ted turned the work of marking essays into an art form. I don't think there ever was or ever will be someone so helpful in the margins. His incisive comments were not reserved for a special few. In his Shakespeare lectures, I was his TA 2 semesters, and he personally marked up every one of the 125 student essays, twice each semester. This just is not done. I'll never forget his generosity in reading my own work. I remember as a new graduate student trying to impress him, and his note at the end saying, "Good, but you're lighting a cigarette with a blowtorch." Okay. And I'll never forget one comment on my manuscript for a book on Philip Sidney. He wrote, "Does it matter that I am on page 37 and you have not yet mentioned Sidney?" When Ted made a point, he made a point. Ted's self-help sheet was famous. It embodied the principle that the first step to learning what will do is learning what will not do. And it noted that a pedant is usually just someone with higher standards than your own. It enshrined such classic commands as, "Never shall the hand of appearance brush up against the thigh of reality." From beginning to end, it militated against jargon and all forms of automated thinking. As with everything Ted did, it was about discovering what it is to be genuine. For Ted, as in teaching and writing, so it was in life. In one of his magisterial little epistles, rightly or not, Ted commended me on my moral stance toward the world. I naturally was quite pleased with the compliment, but it was a bit surprising given that the topic was woodworking, and in particular workbenches. And to be honest, I wasn't clear on what exactly my moral stance was. In fact, I didn't even know that I had one, at least not in those terms. What I did know, though, at that moment, was that Ted had a moral stance toward the world. And from that moment, I wanted to have one too. Over the years, I tried to visit New York as often as possible to see Ted. He always was his compact and vigorous self, even when he was using a cane. On one visit, he energetically questioned my Slavic wife about the Orthodox liturgy. Wasn't sure where this was coming from. It turned out that he was, in his retirement, deeply immersed in Dostoevsky. He explained that he was intent on working out a scheme of calendrical references that he had discerned in one of the novels. The interest was news to me, but not the passion or the intellectual thirst. The last time I was in New York City, I was with my family, and Ted and Christina visited with us at our hotel before we went out for dinner. When they arrived, our eldest two, then ages 8 and 10, were playing chess, and Ted was discussing a variation on a classic opening that was a subject of a story in that morning's New York Times. When we returned home, there was a letter waiting for the boys from Ted. He sent a clipping from the newspaper and a note that captures Ted's admirable condescension, in the best Jane Austen sense of the term. It read, "Adam, Thomas, it was a pleasure to meet you, gentlemen. Your future seems secure. Your friend, Ted Tayler." Ted didn't need to do that, but he was always doing good and valuable things that he simply didn't have to do. Humor, humanity, and always a surprise. That was Ted. It's good to remember him, and I always will. Thank you.
All right. I'm going to keep this very short, not only because so many other people have spoken so eloquently and wonderfully about Professor Tayler, which I can only call him Professor Tayler, so forgive me, and also because the longer I stay up here, the less likely I'll be able to maintain my composure, but also because Professor Tayler taught me, among many other things, to cut to the chase, and to be his student was to learn to try at least to resist grandiloquence in any possible form. So in as near a plain style as I can muster, and one of his legacies was to instill in me a love of the plain style poets of the 16th century, Barnaby Googe among them. I will say that Edward Tayler taught me how to read and how to write and how to think and how, again, to be while doing all of those things. 25 years later, I cannot step into a classroom without hoping, although likely hoping in vain, to convey some of that combination of deep solemnity about what we were doing and high spirits that characterized all his lectures and seminars. And I say high spirits, and I'm also, I should point out that one of my friends from Columbia recently sent me some photographs, some scanned photographs of our final 16th century poetry seminar, which was a bit of a reception, end of the semester thing. And there he was, and the cigarette was there. It was 1993. I think cigarettes were still allowed. And there may or may not have been a giant bottle of Beefeater on the table in Philosophy Hall. So high spirits, not in that sense. I cannot mark a paper without at least trying to engage as carefully as he did with every word that his students wrote, as some of our speakers have already talked about. And I cannot write anything myself without envisioning that unmistakable italic handwriting in my imaginary margins, pointing out solecisms with a devastating WW, which is Taylorese for wrong word. Like I'm sure so many of Professor Taylor's students, I kept my papers and my notebooks from his lectures and his seminars, and they sit in my office over in Philosophy Hall in a kind of talismanic folder that I look at from time to time. And as I thought about what to say today, I pulled out the folder and read through various iterations of the self-help sheet and my notes on Shakespeare and Donne, and a set of essays I wrote in his 16th century poetry seminar, fall of '93. I was reminded that printers were truly terrible in the early '90s. One bit of marginalia, Professor Taylor wrote, "Your dots lack matrix," which I thought was fair enough. But I was also reminded of the intensity of those classes. These were undergraduate classes. We had the same assignments that I suppose he had in his graduate seminars, which was read the collected works of Spenser and choose the best poems and talk about why in 2 pages or less. We all had a sense in those classes that we were doing something very important, that the stakes of reading a poem could not be higher, and that he was, and this is to quote his customary sign-off in later correspondence, they're in the ranks with us. He would often sign letters to me, "Yours in the ranks, Ted," which was always kind of choked me up a bit. So we were working together, and so I thought the best tribute to him would be to read, again, like Diana, I brought some documentary evidence, to read one set of his marginal comments in real time so that we can all hear, and those of us who were his students can remember just how vividly present and alive and in dialogue he was with every word that his 19-year-old student in the fall of 1993 was saying about Fulk Greville. And it's, again, testimony to Professor Taylor that the words Fulk Greville have been spoken twice in Philosophy Hall today. So, right on. So this is my paper, fall of '93, Fulk Greville, and I'm just going to read his comments. Okay, and it begins with a characteristic Taylorian litotes, which is apparently, I said something that was, anyway, okay, neatly done. I'm not quite sure what you're driving at here, WW. I think I'm following. Crucial, zoom in. Ambitious, word, what, WW? Okay, hey, wait. Go for it, go, hey, wait. Smart paragraph, but the last sentence may elide the central issue. Wait, I'm with you, but you may want to change the formulation. Something skewed here, WW. I think I follow. Yeah, I see. Legitimate inference, though you're missing the primary meaning. Love it. Yes, careful. You almost have it here, zero in. C. Burton, but use the final couplet. Okay, go. Go. Yeah, go. Not sure I get it. Wait. Go, making my teeth itch. Go, go. And that was it. And then the final comment said, think more psychology and theology. Don't stop thinking poets and poetry. And so I'll just end by saying that I haven't and I won't. And thank you to Professor Taylor.
Hi. It's interesting to hear Ted being talked about as this incredible showman, which we all know he was, but in my sense, he was also the most humble genius I ever met. Humble because what he seemed to want most was to connect with his students. He didn't seem to care about publishing, about garnering a name, except as this magnificent professor around the world. His mission was biblical, to be a messenger of Shakespeare's genius, to inspire us, to blow our minds open, as Tony so eloquently put it, and he did. And I have a feeling he would be blushing and weeping at the accolades being lavished upon him today by everyone. He would also say, the timing is all, hurry up and finish. A few years ago, I had to give a speech about my time at Columbia. I came here in the 80s when New York City was a different town. And I have these twin images, because I couldn't remember much else, in my mind from those days. At the beginning of the year, a few enterprising freshmen foraging through the streets stumbled upon a carpet in a dumpster. This is not an urban myth. They couldn't believe their luck. They dragged the thing upstairs to their dorm room, unfurled it, and out rolled a dead body. Now, didn't they notice how heavy it was? Maybe, as Taylor would later make me realize, they didn't want to. But I've never looked at a rolled up carpet the same since. The other image I maintained was Ted Taylor, as many of you remembered, in his cowboyish boots and black leather jacket, often with his motorcycle helmet in tow, arriving to class so short and so cool, he would look around trying to make eye contact with each of us, and then begin to speak from his golden notebook. I was mesmerized, so was the class. We'd walk out sometimes in silence, silent wonder, sure that we just experienced some essential truth that was still revealing itself in the weeks and months to come, like the best performances, ephemeral but penetrating. As I traveled in the ensuing years on assignment around the world, Ted Taylor's voice, his words, and the way he enabled us to see Shakespeare's characters all around us traveled with me, a companion, a messenger, a teacher. We all have a Falstaff in our lives, someone or some part of ourselves we must shed to become our destiny. He never said it explicitly, but we understood what he meant. All of King Lear he showed us could be understood in two homophones throughout the play. No, no, K-N-O-W-N-O, and I, I-E-Y-E. No is said 842 times, he said. No, K-N-O-W, 112, C, 116. And this was before, you could do search through the play, so we counted them. Lear and Gloucester see but are blind, say no, 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 because they don't want to know. Lear most of all. Gloucester is literally blinded, his eye plucked out, so his eye can see. Whether it was the president of Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai, or the Shakespeare professor from Serbia who was bombing Sarajevo, or American generals and politicians in Pakistan and Iraq, or those most dear to us, Taylor's insights keep returning like the best songs. People don't want to know, don't want to see, can't bear to see what they know, just like those freshmen and their heavy carpet. It just so happened that Ted was at that speech when I spoke of his influence, and his wife, Christina, wrote to me to say that he burst into tears when I spoke of him, and how she understood again how much he lived for his students. We agreed to meet for a meal, but the years passed, until finally Michael Rosenthal arranged it. And I was lucky enough to have lunch with Ted just a few weeks before he unexpectedly died. I was enthralled by his vitality, his self-deprecating, poignant jokes about becoming a very foolish, fond old man, though not blind like Lear. One of the other gifts Ted had was to see into your adolescent soul, to see what you could not. I told him that. I said, "You changed my life," like we all said. "Really?" he said, with genuine wonder, much like he said, "Really? Did I say that in class?" when I repeated one of his jewels. I need to write that down. "Yes, really," I said. I had been, after undergraduate, I had been his teaching assistant as a graduate student, and I was preparing to teach that horrifying course, Logic and Rhetoric. And one day he told me, "This may not be what you want to do, but you will be fabulous at it." He was right. It's not what I wanted to do. Instead, after Ted's penetrating insight, I dropped out of school and soon set off for the Balkans and beyond. I told him that story over lunch, And you know what he did? He wept. Then he said, "Pray, do not mock me." I hugged him instead. Thank you, Ted. You were a magical gift that keeps on giving for all of us, fortunate enough to have experienced you.
In January 2013, I got this email from Ted. Got a couple of nice tributes from former students. He had just told me that he was retiring. Got a couple of nice tributes from former students, making me feel a little less retired, in quote marks, which is to say, useless, foolish, tired, slow, impotent, haggard, nervous, irritable, sluggish, unloved, unwanted, and so on. And you? As that email conveys, he was so comfortable with language and so adept at it that he brought fun and pleasure and was capable of deep intelligence, wonderful scholarship, serious teaching, and at all of that he was successful, to say the least. He was a celebrated teacher. He had been a celebrated teacher already in the 1960s when I first met him. I was a graduate student teaching freshman English, not that terrible course that you described, Elizabeth, but he had a swift understanding. And I'll give you an example of it. He wrote a letter of recommendation once for my wife, Rosemary, who's a psychoanalyst. And he wrote about her writing, her conversation, and the significance of her work. And I must say, it was a gorgeous letter of recommendation. And we privately think, it's now public, that because of that letter she won an award. But he was magnificent in that way and understood her work and its place in the history of psychoanalysis. In the 1960s, he was already, as I said, a celebrated teacher. Later, we became friends. I became chair of an interdisciplinary program in the humanities at Wesleyan, and we had junior comprehensive exams at the end of the junior year, and that qualified people for going on to write a thesis that they were interested in. I invited Ted to be an examiner one year, early on. And he was, you'll not be surprised, thoroughgoing, probing, and the students reported that they really liked the experience of being examined by him. They found him fun, and they talked easily about it. So a few years later, I invited him again. Chrissy and Ted and my wife Rosemary and I had subsequently become a lay analyst, psychoanalyst too. We would have an annual dinner in January when the American Psychoanalytic Association met at the Waldorf Astoria. And those dinners were really a treat. Such fun, guffaws, and at the same time, a sense of immediacy, being present, and being trusting and truthful with one another. That was really delightful. He had a way of providing a feeling of mutuality in the friendship. And he had a terrific pleasure in laughing at himself. Once they were visiting us in Connecticut, and it was early in the summer, and I had ordered a cord of wood for the fireplace, and while they were visiting, I at one point was stacking the wood, and he said, "I have a name for you, Woodstarker." And I said, "Well, that's a good name. What name do you call yourself?" He said, "Fartzenswager." So it was typical. He would love to make fun of himself too. And at the end of emails would often sign them as "Lovable Old Ted." And as was already mentioned, yours in the ranks. He was very playful and certainly very interested in sharing thoughts about sexuality. Once he and I were playing tennis, and then Chrissy and Rosemary and I went for a swim, and he was going to join us, but when we left, we realized he had never showed up. We found him watching a tennis match between two women. And I said, "Are they really that good that you gave up a swim?" He said, "Look at those legs." And there was a time when both Rosemary and I were talking at the American Psychoanalytic in January, and Ted got fouled up and could not make the meeting. And he said, "I am bereft. Thanks and looking forward to dinner. As for the meeting, Chris will be there. I may be able to make Rosie," and then parentheses. Did I just say that? So, and then yours in the ranks. Yours in the ranks is a line from King Lear. And for all his fun, yours in the ranks is finished with the words, "in death." Yours in the ranks in death. For all his fun, he was the first of us to leave, to die. And what's left for us is to remember not only the present great source of sorrow, but of delicious remembering and of loving.
I'm Letta Tayler, one of 5 children of the man we knew, not as EWT or Professor Taylor, but mostly as Daddy or Dear Old Dad, which was often a signature to his finely written letters to us, written DOD. I didn't know I was coming up here, so I have nothing prepared. I was asked to read a lovely remembrance of my dad by Jhumpa Lahiri, but I must say that what's running through my mind right now are memories of a man perhaps many of you did not know, the man with a voracious appetite for pop culture. I was at a very tender age when my father brought me to see all the James Bond movies and Clockwork Orange, and I think most of my siblings will remember that too. Orange Julius, Nathan's Hot Dogs, Days on the Beach. This was the dear old dad we knew, but we also knew him as a great mind, a mind that was generous with us, benevolent, ever present even as so much of his attention was turned to his life as a professor. I'm not here to talk to you about any of that, but I must say that a memorable experience in my life was sitting through one of his lectures, the only one I sat in on, where of course he made a point of turning to me and asking me my views on sex and death. My father had 5 of us, but really he had thousands of children. Many of you are here today. He loved you all. You made him tick. Thank you for being there for him. Now I turn to the remembrance of Jhumpa Lahiri. And pardon me, because again, I'm reading this cold, without my reading glasses. 10 Feb 2019. It was a year-long course, Shakespeare 1 and 2. I registered for the second part first in the spring semester of my junior year. The class was held on Tuesdays and Thursdays in the afternoon. 31 years ago, 1988, marble steps, hard underfoot, lead to the classroom on the 6th floor of Hamilton Hall. It was always crowded on the stairs. The lecture room had wooden seats, large windows along 2 of the walls. I sat on the right side of the aisle in the 3rd or 4th row. I had a used copy of the Pelican Shakespeare, which we had been told to obtain. Professor Taylor, short, bespectacled, stood at the lecture. He dressed formally. I see him in a gray jacket and tie. We were a large group. How many? 50? Twice that? Too many, in any case, for him to know us individually. All the seats were filled. I took notes. I would have liked to have written down everything he said. He didn't just cite Shakespeare. He cited the Bible, E.H. Gombrich, Wallace Stevens, Schubert's Death and the Maiden, Nabokov's Ada. He expected us to know what he was referring to or to look things up if we didn't. I understand now that this was his way of respecting us, treating us like adults. He was both solemn and electrifying, placid but very intense. He was never pedantic. He was ironic now and then. I would edit that a little bit. There were times when, reciting a certain line, his voice struggled and eyes seemed to fill with tears. I would add, filled with tears. His love and reverence for what he taught was pure, almost contagious. The class was an awakening, an initiation, a call to arms. He guided us, he illuminated, he parted a curtain onto life's great questions and mysteries. He made us see the links between poetry contained in that heavy black book and our own lives. He spoke with directness about difficult matters. He talked about love and grief, things I had little experience of at the age of 20, but he prepared the groundwork for things to come. I began to live for Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. I prepared diligently. I filled pages with notes. I wrote out quotes of various characters in various Shakespeare plays on index cards and filled an entire shoebox with them. I reviewed these quotes in my spare time, hoping to memorize them. I went to a study session on Sundays. All this I did with great joy. I was in love with Shakespeare, and as a result, for the first time at college, I was happy. I wrote my final paper on A Winter's Tale. I titled the paper, A Masked Bud Discloses, citing one of the sonnets. I wanted to impress. We had to submit the paper with a self-addressed envelope. Professor Tayler said he would read them and send them back to us over the summer. I awaited this envelope eagerly. He liked the title. He found fault with everything else. When I opened the envelope in the hallway of my parents' home, I saw the grade and his comments heavy in the margins and wept. In the fall, I returned to complete the full sequence of the course. I was humiliated by my poor grade, but I loved the course even more. One day, I made an appointment to meet Professor Tayler and talk about the paper I planned to write on Richard III. His office was in another building. I felt disoriented. I was nervous to interact with him on my own. I can't remember what I said. During the meeting, he talked to me about my paper, and then he wrote down a brief list on a sheet of paper, slowly, in his slanted calligraphy with a ballpoint pen. The list consisted of 4 or 5 words, nothing more. Among them were the words analyze and oscillate. I felt that I'd been handed a code in a secret language. In fact, I was not quite sure how to decipher this enigmatic list, nor did I know how it would help me. But I studied it, hoping to absorb its meaning. I wrote the paper. It was brief, only a few pages. One day, I missed class. I must have been feeling poorly. A friend who took the class with me called me excitedly afterward. She said Professor Tayler had read my paper aloud to the class, citing it as an example. It was, in spite of my absence, the proudest moment of my life thus far. For many, many years, I kept the list of words he had written down for me inside one of the plastic sleeves of my agenda, designed to hold credit cards or business cards. Once the piece of paper was folded up, the list occupied just that amount of space. It became a talisman. It went wherever I did. I can no longer quote it exactly because I carry a different style of agenda these days, without the plastic sleeves. But I know exactly where to find the list, where I need it, were I to need to consult it, and were I able to reach from the study in Rome, where I write this remembrance, to my study in Princeton. I have kept all the notebooks and the Pelican Shakespeare with all my annotations, reinforced with white tape on the spine, always as a permanent place on the bookshelves of the various rooms in which I have written. When I reread Shakespeare or go to see one of the plays, I still hear Professor Tayler's voice reciting certain lines. I have a pain upon my forehead here. Pray you, undo this button, and still feel the impact of realizing what they really meant. To think back to that class, to those lectures, is to recall a moment in which my life took a thrilling and permanent turn. It led eventually to my doctoral dissertation, which in turn led me to Italy. It led to a life of reading and striving to write well. It led to the realization that whatever happens in life, there is always Shakespeare to turn to. Thank you.